Thank you for joining us, everyone, this afternoon. We are happy to have you here for this webinar. Over the past year, Team NEO has been focused on mitigating the impacts of the pandemic for the businesses and ensuring continued growth and progress for Northeast Ohio region. We've engaged with business leaders to identify challenges. We've developed solutions and strategies to continue moving forward, and we've leveraged our Jobs Ohio partnership to communicate local and regional needs to the state. Now, as more people are going back to the pre-pandemic workspace, we'd like to help companies prepare. Today, you're attending part one of a two-part Restart webinar series. We'll explore issues to consider from the legal perspective, such as how to respond when an employee requests to continue working from home. Can you make it a mandate for employees to be vaccinated? How do you make sure to stay in compliance with changing health and safety protocols in the workspace? We invite you to join the conversations by posing your questions in the chat feature. Our panel will have time to answer questions towards the end of the program. I'm Dawn Southard, Vice President, Investor Relations for Team NEO, and at this point, I'd like to turn the program over to Team NEO's CEO, Bill Kaler. Bill?
Thanks, Dawn. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for investing your time with us to learn a little bit about the path forward. We are very grateful to hear from a number of our partners who've been thinking about these issues from our Northeast Ohio law firms, from Franz Ward, McDonald Hopkins, Meyers, Friedberg, and Lewis, and Tucker Ellis. And all of them, in addition to having deep expertise in this area, have been thinking about and advising companies about these issues for some time, have been very involved in our work, which we think is so critically important in driving economic development forward, having a network of not just economic development focused professionals, but private sector leaders who are also engaged in the work as well. They've been involved in our Right Sides Council, which is a group that provides strategic insights to the process of identifying and preparing competitive sites to make us better able to attract businesses here and better able to attract major expansion opportunities here. They've been members of, they and members of their team have referred us to clients, people in organizations that are thinking about major investments in Northeast Ohio, and they've helped us find ways to support those companies as they explore those investments. And then we've relied on them for legal advice in different ways. So they've been great partners. We appreciate the expertise of the team here and their partners in their organization. And we're looking forward to the opportunity to hear about how we can move forward in building a more resilient and emerging economy as we move forward. We've all faced the challenges when the lockdown order started about this time a year ago, and many businesses thought about closing. And while many of the organizations pivoted to a remote workspace during this pandemic, now people are beginning to think about what does it mean to come back? And does that mean in person? Does it mean hybrid? What does it mean? And how are we going to make sure we continue the momentum in our organizations and from our perspective at Team NEO and the economy overall. Opening businesses will look different. We believe it. For Team NEO, for sure it will, with different safety measures, different policy requirements, different choices that people are going to make as they think about how can we be more effective and impactful in whatever they choose to do. And we're looking forward to the opportunities to hear the insight from this group is to tell us what are the unique challenges we all ought to be thinking about when we make those choices about efficiency, effectiveness, impact, in whatever that means in the work we do. So at this time, thank you all for your insights in advance. I'd like to turn the program over to Karina Conley from McDonald Hopkins, who's going to moderate our panel and take it from here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill. As Bill mentioned, my name is Karina Conley. I'm an attorney with McDonald Hopkins here in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm a member of our firm's labor and employment practice group, where I regularly represent and counsel employers and members of management regarding various labor and employment issues, such as leave and the very issues that we're discussing here today. Like Bill mentioned, the world that employers operate in now is diametrically different from where it was even a year ago. At that time, as he mentioned, a lot of people were trying to just find ways to keep the doors open and navigating, in some instances, to remote work or modifying operations to ensure employee safety and stop the spread of COVID-19. Now, as more of us and more people throughout the state of Ohio are vaccinated, employers are asking themselves different questions to navigate this return back to work, either in person or to what a lot of people think will be a new normal. I think we can all venture to guess that it may not go back exactly to how it was. And there's a lot of legal implications involved as we process back to this new workplace. Today, we have a fantastic panel of fellow attorneys in the labor and employment field who regularly counsel employees on these questions and who are here to talk about, as I mentioned, the current state of the law and potential trends going forward. I would be deficient in attempting to introduce these amazing practitioners, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I will start with Brian. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll work our way down before jumping right into the questions.
Thanks, Karina. My name is Brian Kelly. I chair the Labor and Employment Group at the law firm of France Ward. I spent the last coming up on 27 years here in Cleveland working with companies in all sectors to develop policies and procedures to head off problems and develop plans like we're talking about here. And then on the back end where things go awry to address the litigation, arbitrations, things like that. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us. Christine, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Christine Snyder. I am a partner in the Labor and Employment Group at Tucker Ellis in the Cleveland office. Like Brian, I kind of wear both hats. I hope to prevent my clients from getting into trouble in the first place when it comes to labor and employment issues, but then also there to help defend them in cases where litigation or other disputes arise.
Okay. And last, but certainly not least, Seth, tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice.
Sure. I'm Seth Briskin. I'm the chair of the Labor Employment Group here at Meyers, and they tell me I'm also the managing partner of the organization. I'm much more proud of the prior title than the latter title, but be that as it may, I do all the same things that Brian and Christine do, and I'm a bit of a dinosaur in that I still do a lot of labor and employment. Traditional labor with union work, and very involved with OSHA and safety and health side of things for employers. And I'm also deficient in that I don't have my firm's background like Brian does, or a pretty picture like Christine does. I've got my rock and roll sort of background to me, so I'm a bit of an oddball for this panel, but nonetheless, we cover the same things.
To each their own, to each their own. One of the most common questions that I have heard, certainly, and I'm sure all of you have heard, and I'm sure that everyone on the call and the panel is looking to discuss, is can I make the COVID-19 vaccine mandatory for either current employees or prospective employees? Brian, what's the current state of the law there?
Oh, well, Karina, to make a complicated issue simple, which lawyers, of course, never do, to the extent there's a simple answer to the question, the answer is yes. In most circumstances, especially here in Ohio and under federal law, employers can say, I am going to make the vaccine mandatory for employees and applicants in my workplace. It's always, when dealing with lawyers, there's a longer answer to that as well. And there are exceptions to that. And those of us here who practice in this area know those exceptions are growing in size by the day. And you can drive a truck or perhaps a barge through a Suez Canal large enough through some of these exceptions. But the couple primary ones to back off of the can you legally mandate the vaccine, the biggest ones people jump to right away would be medical exemptions. And if an employer says, I'm going to mandate the vaccine for my employees, certainly employees who have got a medical issue that could rise to the level of being a disability. As with all disability circumstances, the employees are entitled to ask for an accommodation and say, look, my medical condition is a disability. As an accommodation, I want to be excused from the vaccine requirement. And in most circumstances, Those medical exemptions need to be considered at very least. The employer, as those of us on this call would say, we go through the interactive process, gather the information, take a look at your operation, and not every medical exemption request, whether under ADA or otherwise, is going to be required. But certainly that interactive process is something that people have to go through. And the other major exemption is a religious exemption to a vaccine requirement. And we've been seeing this for years with just things like the standard flu vaccine for those of us who do a lot of work in the healthcare and education sectors. And with the religious exemptions, employees can come in and say, I have a sincerely held religious belief, and that conflicts with your vaccine requirement. And so I want that accommodated as well. Now, that leads a lot of employers to scratch their head because practitioners, they already know that a sincerely held religious belief is a very broad category, and it doesn't necessarily fit within what some might consider mainstream religious beliefs. And so, as with the medical exemptions, Karina, what you have to do is, of course, gather some information, go through that individualized type assessment. So those are the two big ways we have to back off a little bit from the can I make the vaccine mandatory question. There are other items that I would throw out that need to be kept in mind as well. Anytime we've got a controversial issue like this, there are going to be very creative and intelligent people that are going to find ways to challenge it. And we've seen that with the vaccine. One group has actually filed federal litigation arguing that it's illegal for an employer to make the vaccine mandatory because the FDA only authorized the vaccine for emergency use. So there's some arguments that by itself means it can't be mandatory. Now that lawsuit's pending. There hasn't been any type of determination, but we can certainly expect challenges like that. Same as for employers that operate in multiple states. We're seeing efforts in a variety of states, some of which are relatively predictable, that believe in civil liberties being unassailable on any level, to pass laws that would prohibit employers from making vaccines mandatory. And for those operating in multiple states, that's certainly something to keep an eye on. A final point on the can an employer make it mandatory, and Seth hinted at it just a minute ago. I also do a lot of traditional labor work, meaning like Seth, I work with unions and management as well. I'm always on the management side, but for employers who have unions, in almost every situation, they're going to have to bargain with the union about either the decision to implement a mandatory vaccine policy or the effects of that type of policy, and in some circumstances, both. And a failure to do that could get an employer in quite a bit of hot water, whether charges before the NLRB, grievances, and even in some instances, federal injunctions. So that's the very, very longer answer to the can I mandate it. And I expect Christine and Seth might have some thoughts on that as well.
My only thoughts would really be what I'm observing is that most of the employers that I speak to on a regular basis making it mandatory, they're strongly encouraging it.
I think we're back. Sorry, I froze there for a second.
Froze for a while. So was it just me?
Yes, everybody had some freezing. That has not changed in the last year. That is still happening for everyone. And kind of alluded to, as Brian kept mentioning, can I implement or mandate vaccines for my employees? Another question that I'm hearing a lot, and that employers have frequently, is should I mandate the vaccine, and what the legal implications are if they don't do so. From a health and safety standpoint, what are you seeing, Seth?
Well, it seems like I've got the pragmatic side of the question, and that is, can I walk across a busy highway? The answer is yes, I can do that. Should I do it? That's a different answer, I think. So every employer is different. So I would tell you that you've got to, again, take a very individualized look at your business and decide whether or not it's something that you really, really have to make mandatory. Because as Brian pointed out, Christine, to a degree before freezing up, pointed out that There are going to be exceptions. There's always going to be exceptions. And my law firm, we've got 70 plus people working here, for instance, and we've been in more or less full operation with some blips and some stops and some starts along the way since COVID broke out back in March. We've allowed people to work from home, certainly. We've been flexible, certainly. But by and large, most of us have been working here, and our staff is at full capacity right now. And if I decided today that I wanted to make vaccines mandatory, I know even in my law firm, there are going to be people who don't want to do it for a variety of reasons, valid and protected and not protected. So I get back to the pragmatic question, should I do it? Should I do it? Do I need to do it? That's a big question, because in this age of COVID, employers have shown incredible resilience. They've shown incredible flexibility and the ability to accommodate. So how, as an employer, can you say, I'm going to mandate this and I'm going to eliminate all flexibility that I've been showing for the last year plus and just turn on a dime? Even if I don't have a protected reason on the ADA or religious belief, why can't I accommodate somebody's otherwise held belief, non-protected belief, and why they don't want to have a vaccine? And I've heard many reasons given, from the conspiracy theorists to chips in head to you name it. So it's there, and you have to understand that. So should I do it? That's a different question. If you are in a certain industry, I think the question is more difficult to answer, because if you're in the healthcare industry, if you're in a nursing home industry, assisted living industry, food industry, there are industries where you can make a straight-faced case that in order to maintain a safe workplace and to keep my population of employees and guests and visitors and residents, or whatever the case may be, safe, I need to mandate it. But then once you make that decision, you have to deal with the repercussions. So if you mandate it, are you prepared for your best employees to say, I don't want to do this. If you're mandating it, I'm leaving. Are you prepared for that? Can you deal with that? That's a question. With an organization that's near and dear to my heart, OSHA, as it stands today, OSHA was threatening to come out with an emergency temporary standard in mid-March to create a situation where OSHA had a legit standard that they could cite on and create fines and violations and things under the OSHA Act. They haven't come out with a true ETS yet, but they have implemented a national emphasis program, which does allow OSHA to come into facilities and check on your COVID response, your COVID policies, your cleanliness, any employee complaint and things like that. So should I do it? You've got to start thinking about what are the repercussions for not doing it from a safety and health standpoint. You still have a duty as an employer to provide a generally safe workplace. So if I don't provide mandatory or require mandatory vaccinations, am I violating that duty? That's a question that you've got to ask each individual employer and ask yourself.
Thanks, Seth. Anything else with regard to a safety and health perspective that you're seeing coming out of OSHA, even without the emergency temporary standard, or trends that you anticipate seeing? And again, outside of the vaccinations. Well,
little known fact, here in beautiful Northeast Ohio, we have, depending on the year, the busiest and most active OSHA office in the entire country. So OSHA is out there and they are doing their job, and they do it very well. And they're checking for all different kinds of safety and health issues in the workplace. And they're getting inundated with calls about COVID. And for the longest time, unless you were a health organization of some sort, a hospital, a nursing home, an assisted living home, things like that, OSHA wouldn't bother private employers with visits, citations, phone and faxes, they're called, where there's complaints and inquiries, and employers are expected to abate those situations. But in the healthcare organizations, they are coming out to enforce these things. And while I haven't had too many private sector clients get tagged with any general duty clause issues or things like that, again, what should I do as the employer? You're not going to hear, I don't think, from Brian or from Christine. There are a lot of things that you can do that may or may not even work. Things like sanitizing your workplace and making a big show about, distancing with spacing and hand wipes and everything else. Should you do that though? Are the optics good? Is it good for your employees? Is it good for your guests that come to your office to see that you do those steps? Should is different than can. Should I do it? The answer might be yes, even if it's not efficacious, even if you don't believe that you can get COVID from touching surfaces. Should you have sanitation in your office? Should you put an emphasis on cleaning? Should you do the hand sanitizing and hand washing and all that good stuff? The answer to should, depending on your organization, is probably yes.
And one thing to keep in mind with the should I do it, I've got a number of companies I work with who are seriously considering it. And one thing I tell all of them is before you do it, you ought to take the temperature of your workforce and get an idea. Like Seth was dead on right that the idea of attracting and retaining your current employees is one thing, but you also have to factor in, what am I likely to accomplish? The exemptions here are not difficult for people to avail themselves of. And if your workforce is against a mandatory vaccine, word will get out quickly that if you want to get, for example, a religious exemption, here are the magic words you need to use. And the agencies that police these things are not giving us as employers and as employment lawyers a whole lot of latitude to attack those magic words. If somebody says, for example, the religious belief that I am of this faith or this belief set and this specific vaccine or all the vaccines conflicts with it, if your workforce wants to resist the mandatory vaccine, it will be able to do it effectively. Now, there are situations where employers could try to make the argument that exemptions won't be permitted because someone being in my workplace without the vaccine is a direct threat to everyone else, or my customers, or in healthcare, my patients, or in education, my students. Those direct threat arguments are going to be very difficult to maintain. Especially to the extent that the measures that have been taken, like Seth described over the past 13 months, have been largely effective in most workplaces to prevent workplace type exposure. So I'd factor that into the should I do it as well, that your effort, although well-intentioned and even well-designed, might just flop because of the resistance that I expect you'll encounter.
Yeah, and another thing to consider, Brian, just as a follow-up to you here, as you take the temperature of your employees, as you're potentially requiring employees to be vaccinated and requiring them to submit proof of vaccination, are there any privacy concerns or issues that employers should be looking out for in that after they learn of an employee's vaccination status or opposition to vaccination status?
Karina, it's a great question, and it is an area that's still developing. From the guidance we've been given so far, it seems relatively clear that somebody's vaccination status itself, the do you or don't you have the vaccine, is not protected confidential information. And one thing that all of us on this call, we get all the time is armchair experts who start throwing around anything that might relate to medical at all. This people screaming, well, that's HIPAA protected. It is incredibly rare that someone's correct when they try to use HIPAA to shield some type of disclosure like that. And certainly that's not the case here. So your question, Karina, is a great one. If somebody's just mere vaccination status, if I say I as an employer just want to get an idea whom in my workplace is vaccinated, you can gather that information. I would not publish the information, among other reasons. The people who don't have the vaccine could be someone who has not gotten the vaccine for religious or medical reasons. And you don't want people being singled out for that. But just the vaccination status itself is generally not confidential, which is different from the question of a COVID positive test that all of us in this call have talked with clients and others about before, which is certainly more confidential. One thing to keep in mind for vaccines, though, when we talk about vaccination status and confidential information, is the type of information that's gathered when people are administering and receiving the vaccine. So if you as an employer decide you're going to do an on-site health clinic, administer the vaccine, those simple health history questions that people have to answer before getting the vaccine, those questions reveal confidential information. And so what a lot of employers have found are these on-site health clinics can create difficulty and exposure and give you information you'd rather not have. So yeah, there are confidential information issues that come up and privacy concerns, but they can certainly be addressed if the plan is put together correctly.
And we are going to save some time at the end for questions, but there was one directly online that kind of came through, so I'll open up to the group. For purposes of tracking who employees who are and are not vaccinated, is it okay to ask for proof of the vaccine? You know, we see a lot of people taking selfies with their vaccine cards and posting them on social media. Is it all right for an employer to ask for a copy of that for their records?
As of right now, I would answer the question, yes. We haven't gotten any indication that that's going to be deemed confidential and private information. Again, I wouldn't post pictures of that as the employer. We've seen plenty of individuals through social media and otherwise are sharing it, which I think is great if it helps encourage confidence in the vaccine or peer pressure among others to get it. But the guidance we've gotten so far is just simply if you are gathering information as to the vaccination status of your employees, you can require them to show the card. As with other types of arrangements, if the question is, hey, should I make and keep copies of the card? I wouldn't suggest doing it. There's nothing really to be accomplished by that.
The second most question, and the second largest question we've gotten, or that I get, and that I just hear everyone talking about generally, is as more and more people are vaccinated and the pandemic nears closer to this end, more employees are going to try and transition people back to in-person work, or likely going to do so. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure that it'll ever go back to normal entirely, particularly I think in our area of work and other office environments. But as employers are transitioning back, or employees back into the workforce in person, they will undoubtedly receive a number of requests to continue to remotely work or work from home. And something I've also heard and seen a lot lately is people who are just now entering the workforce, whether it be graduating from college or switching jobs, starting their positions remotely. And so the question will be then again, how to handle prospective employees' requests that the position be remote. Christine, how should employers manage these type of requests?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I feel like we're going to be a little bit repetitive in the way we answer it because it has both legal and practical implications to it. And also, while there is generally no right of employees to be entitled to work remotely, there are also exceptions. So similar to the last question, I know Brian mentioned at the beginning the Americans with Disabilities Act and the obligation that all employers have to accommodate employees who have medical conditions that qualify as a disability. This is another example of a circumstance that could implicate that obligation to engage in that interactive process and determine whether work from home is a reasonable accommodation for someone's medical condition. There have been cases out there where they determined that work from home can be a reasonable accommodation. So for example, say you have an individual who is in your workforce who has a medical condition that makes them particularly vulnerable to contracting COVID-19, and maybe also, just as the example we discussed before, it also makes them where there's someone who cannot receive the vaccination for COVID-19. And so at this point, where we're still seeing significant spread in the community, our numbers still have not lowered to a level that that person in consultation with their doctor feels that it's safe to be back in the office physically. You may get a request that says, I know you're bringing everyone back in, but I am requesting to continue to work from home. So really the first step, your question was, what should they do in response to those requests, is to ask the follow-up, what is the basis for the request? Because if it is one of those scenarios where someone is asking because, and they don't need to use any type of magic words, I'm asking for an accommodation for my medical condition, you really need to be an active listener in those circumstances. But if it's connected to some medical condition that they have, then it may trigger your obligation to engage in that interactive process and consider whether allowing them to continue to work from home for some period of time is a reasonable accommodation. One thing I want to point out there is it is an interactive process, and depending on that discussion, there may be other accommodations that would work for the employee. So for instance, if prior they were in, located where their desk was located in an area where they were around a lot of people, but they themselves would feel comfortable if they were given a private office with a door that would close and feel that that would be sufficient to alleviate their concerns. It's a conversation, right? And you can explore if there are other options, but I would not be surprised if you would receive some requests for medical reasons. But just like the prior conversation that we had, there's also practical implications as well. So I think Seth ran through, whether you can do something, force everyone to come back in person, and whether you should are two different questions. There may be non-protected reasons why employees would make that type of request. And are you prepared to tell some of your best employees, I'm sorry, we're forcing everyone to come in. If you don't come in, that could mean your job, and them making that choice. Okay, I'll find some other place that will accommodate me. So the answer that yes, you can generally, other than with the exception that we discussed, force people to come back, may not be the answer that you actually want to go to from a practical perspective. I think about, and I've heard this from clients, back when schools were deciding about, we're going to reopen, the governor wants us to reopen, but many of them gave parents a choice, right? Opt to send your student back to home for the rest of the school. A employee to continue to have their stay home and the school locked them in. And my reason, I forget. Can everyone hear me? I got a little message that I froze again. I'm so sorry. I'm on the firm's Wi-Fi. I should be doing fine. So I don't know how much of that you heard, but I think of the school children being at home scenario where the parent no longer has the option to re-elect back into sending their children to school. It may be a legitimate situation where they have school-age children at home and no way or no one to care for them, no option to send them back to school for the rest of the year. And you may want to be flexible there and allow those employees that opportunity to continue to work from home, at least until they get to the summer when other childcare options kick in.
Yeah. I've dealt with a lot of situations like Christine's talking about now. And one of the things that a lot of companies are struggling with is separating work from home requests that are based on convenience or personal preference from those that are based on some type of need. And one of the ways that I've addressed the situation is to encourage, not to try to alienate the employees, but to ask them three simple questions. The first being, what obstacle or obstacles are keeping you from returning to the workplace? And whether they're childcare, generalized anxiety, waiting for a vaccine, whatever they may be, but what obstacle or obstacles are keeping you from getting here? Then the second question becomes, what has to happen for those obstacles to be removed? Because if I'm trying to plan a timeline and you tell me you need to be vaccinated, I'll get you vaccinated if you haven't been able to get yourself signed up. Or if they're childcare responsibilities, what's your plan in place to address that? And then the third question is, what do you need from us as a company to try to get you there? So the idea is we're not trying to cut off someone who has a legitimate need or reason to work remotely. But if it's the type of company that wants to get back, Seth's firm has done a great job staying there and keeping people safe and back. And lots of companies I work with are doing the same thing. And so if you have a responsible, measured approach and work with people, you can get them back. But those three questions are a great way to get that dialogue going. If you want to separate those who are working remotely because it's convenient and they like working in their pajamas, as opposed to they have to be there.
And you have to think about the workplace, the workplace pressures that come to bear if you don't communicate that effectively. Because if employees working from home and they don't know the employer shouldn't be telling they see the employees working from home and get a right that everyone should have, and therefore, why do you get it and I don't get it? So effective communication of what you're doing things go forward, I would argue. Everyone seems to be frozen. Was I frozen, Brian, or just it seemed like everybody was frozen other than I am? There's Karina. You seem to be back live.
For a while.
Okay. I think the crowd is saying that I'm coming through all right. My point just being that if communication while you're making decisions is key, because otherwise employees just see other people work from home, not understanding why they can't do the same thing. In addition to that, we should probably mention that the employers still have access to the AFCRA and can provide paid leave for people to stay home for certain select reasons, dealing with childcare and care for COVID conditions and things like that. And employers can still get the tax break on allowing for that paid leave as well right now. That was extended.
Absolutely, all fantastic points. And thank you, Christine. Did you have something else you wanted to add?
Well, I just want to say we didn't talk about the recruitment piece though. And so that's a separate issue, really. Are you going to be able to continue to attract the talent that you want if other businesses in your space of operation are providing some options and some flexibility for employees to work remotely? It may be that while you want everyone back, the market is going to drive that decision. And if more and more employers are starting to offer work from home arrangements as an option, you may need to consider that just from a practical business perspective in order to attract the type of talent that you might want to attract. So that's a completely separate issue that is more on the practical side than on the legal side. Although remember the accommodation issue that we talked about though. So there are, and it's probably too in-depth to go into here, but in the interview process, you have to be very careful about exploring questions about people's medical conditions until you're further along in the process and have made an offer. So, I mean, it may be that a candidate will ultimately request some type of a work from home arrangement tied to a medical condition, but that's not something you want to be inquiring into early in the interview process. You can run afoul of that very, very quickly. So.
Absolutely. I think, as you kind of allude to, in addition to workplace changes and in-person work changes, there's going to be a lot of modifications that we need to take cognizant of with regard to hiring practices. Phrases such as vulnerable population, long hauler, and those diagnoses are now in our vernacular. Just know we refer to. How do employers prevent unconscious bias and/or discrimination in their hiring practices in this post-COVID-19 world?
Yeah, so the same law that I think we've touched on a lot here, the Americans with Disabilities Act, kind of has protections for people who are not only disabled, but also for people who are perceived as disabled. And so I see some issues arise there if unconsciously you might be screening candidates or screening people you hire based on any of those protected characteristics, not just under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but there's also some other protected characteristics under the law. So for example, if during an interview conversation it comes up that a person did in fact contract COVID-19, had severe symptoms or had lingering symptoms, that long hauler that you describe. If in any way that fact works its way into your decision-making process and you decide, I don't want to move forward with with this candidate based on that, you do run the risk that it could violate the law based on that person's actual disability or your perception that they are disabled in some way. For example, that, I'm worried about hiring this person because maybe they're going to need additional medical care in the future because I don't know what these symptoms are going to mean down the road. That does create some risk there. I also worry about age. Age is protected under the law, age discrimination, and we tend to think older people are more vulnerable to COVID-19, are more vulnerable to having more severe symptoms if they contract COVID-19. So any elimination or not considering or not moving forward in the hiring process with someone because of their age is problematic already. But if it arises because of your concerns over COVID-19, that's an equal concern there. So there's a risk there that that there could be some legal implications if you're screening out employees on those protected characteristics that might be tied to COVID-19, either diagnosis or risk of exposure.
Absolutely. I am going to actually, we're going to shift here. We have received a number of questions from our attendees. And so we want to make sure we get to those. So the first, I'm going to go through like a speed lightning round if we can. I know it's hard for us as attorneys to do that. But we've got about 20 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we cover some of these as well as get some final thoughts from you guys on what employers should be doing and considering going forward. So the first question that we received, I'll just start from the top and I'll pose it probably to Seth, is can employers be held liable for not requiring the vaccine?
No. That's a quick lawyer answer for a very complicated question. So imagine the nursing home that doesn't mandate vaccines and one of the residents contracts it and dies. What's going to happen as a result of that? Will an employer get called on the carpet about not mandating a vaccine? Can a lawsuit occur in that circumstance? The answer, I think everybody on this panel is going to nod and say yes, a lawsuit can occur. Is it a defensible one? Yeah, because there is no requirement to mandate vaccines, and there are a whole host of exceptions that, to use Brian's great analogy, you can drive a barge through if you're at least a semi-decent captain. And so as a result, can you get sued for it? Sure. Will it be a successful one? Not necessarily. There's a big difference. And again, if I'm the pragmatic answer of questions, the difference between can and should with mandating, lots of employers are not mandating, but they're heavily incentivizing. So there's nothing wrong with incentivizing employees to get vaccinated and get vaccinated. And in fact, employers are coming up with all kinds of creative ways to do it. And there are many states that are allowing for paid leaves of absence to be used, state mandated paid leaves of absence in states like New York, DC, certainly California, and some others where you can use state mandated paid leave to go get vaccinated. So in Ohio, where we don't have that, you as the employer can absolutely put some great incentives in place to give employees who might have a difficult time getting vaccinated due to time or family or whatever the case may be, give them the ability and the time to go do it and take away the cost factor from doing it. That's a good should I vaccine. How should I encourage vaccination as opposed to mandating it?
And I actually stand corrected. We're supposed to wrap up at 12:45. So we do have a number of questions here in the chat that we didn't address on the actual webinar section, but you can follow up with us individually, follow up with Dawn and answer those questions and try and reach out to you to get them answered. These are all certainly questions that are complex and are not going away anytime soon, as COVID is not completely going away anytime soon. So I'll kick it back to Bill and Dawn, and I thank everyone on the panel again, and thank everybody as well for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you for your time, everyone, today. And we have a lot of great questions, so there will be some answers that are attached with the follow-up and recording that we'll be sending out to you after today's webinar. And so with that, thank you, everyone. I'm going to pass this over to Bill to give a few final comments. Thank you.
So I will just say I appreciate the opportunity to hear about some frameworks, the way of for us to think about how to navigate some very challenging issues. So thank you all for that. For the listeners, thanks for your patience with respect to the feed. It's the fun of live TV, as they used to say when we were younger. Karina, your leadership of the discussion was awesome. Christine, Seth, Brian, your insight is great. And for all four of you, thanks so much for your support and engagement and partnership and all the work we do together. And I hope everybody found this helpful, and I hope you have a great day. And this gets us thinking. On April 12th, we will be doing another, the second part of this series that is on restarting from the perspective of company culture and talent. We touched on some of those today, but I would envision a broader discussion. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope everybody found this helpful. Feedback is a gift, good, bad, or indifferent. We'd love to hear it, and it'll help us think about the next part of the series. All the best. Have a good one.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.